Okay, guess we're ready to go. Are the cameras ready? And I did turn it on. Okay, well, thank you all for coming, even if you couldn't help it. I'd like to thank the Lake Superior Freethinkers for inviting me, and Tom and Joyce for putting Rachel and I up for the night. We're always a delightful couple to visit. I'm going to divide my talk into two parts. And first, I'll talk about why many people, including me, think that free will is an illusion. And then we'll take a break and discuss just that part. And then I'll talk about the consequences of the free will illusion, including how this affects moral responsibility. So I have bad news and good news, and it's the same news. There are no gods. Free will is an illusion. Altruism doesn't exist, despite what our introductory speaker said. Altruism doesn't exist, and evolution rules. This is bad news for our egos, but generally good news for the future of humanity. Perhaps in the end you'll agree with me that it's a good thing that we don't have free will. So what are the resistance and objections to perceiving and accepting the illusion of free will? The first is that free will feels so real. Then fear that we won't be able to hold people responsible. Fear that we won't be able to justify disciplining anyone. Fear that people will start acting immorally. Fear that we'll start acting randomly or uncontrollably. Fear that we'll stop trying to do anything, a sense of helplessness. Fear that nothing we do will matter anymore, which is fatalism. Fear that life will no longer be worth living. Our egos won't let us acknowledge that we're not in control. And the mistaken belief that compatibilist free will is actually free will. And for those of you who don't know what compatibilist free will is, I'll explain it during my presentation. And hopefully by the end of this presentation, I'll have addressed all of these issues. In order to answer the question of whether or not we have free will, we have to start with two very basic questions. What is existence composed of, and how does existence operate? So let's start with our first question. What is existence composed of? There are basically two choices, monism and dualism. Monism states that only natural material things exist, and dualism states that supernatural, immaterial things also exist. Dualists believe in things like ghosts, spirits, gods, and disembodied minds. Since I'm speaking to an audience that probably doesn't believe in supernatural or immaterial things, let's focus on monism, the natural, material world. So our second question is, how does this material existence operate? We start our discussion with the classic Newtonian physics phenomenon of determinism. This is absolute cause and effect, leading to perfect predictability. Almost everything above the atomic level, which we could call the macro level, follows strict determinism almost all of the time. And this is known as adequate determinism. The opposite of determinism is indeterminism. And I found several definitions of indeterminism, but these three seem to cover all the possibilities. First, a cause may determine a single effect, but that effect is unpredictable. Second, a cause may have more than one possible effect, and thus the effect is unpredictable. And third, there may be an effect that doesn't have a cause, and thus the effect is unpredictable. Frankly, I don't know that there is such a thing, an uncaused cause or a thing that is its own cause. But if it existed, it would fall under indeterminism, because you couldn't predict what would pop into existence. Indeterminism applies mostly at the atomic level, or what we might call the micro level, things like quantum mechanics, the uncertainty principle, and radioactive decay. Some people might argue that some of these things should be categorized under determinism. And for the purposes of free will, I don't think it matters, because I don't think any existing physical phenomena allow for free will. Determinism does not allow for free will because we can't break into the chain of cause and effect. Indeterminism does not allow for free will because by definition we can't control it. So let's examine these more closely, starting with determinism. A comic I came across, what do you mean quantum fluctuation? Didn't we discuss cause and effect? Broken lamp there. All discussion of free will starts with determinism. In 1814, the French mathematician and philosopher Pierre-Simon Laplace published an essay that translates into English as a philosophical essay on probabilities. So here you see two charts comparing science with mostly determinism and science with indeterminism or chaos. If you did an experiment and you never know what was going to come because determinism wasn't operating, you get haphazard results. But because determinism is operating, we get those kind of results. And this is more human error, actually, on the side than it is any sort of determinism going on. In order for free will to exist, you would have to be able to control determinism. In order to do that, you would need an uncaused cause in order to break into the chain of cause and effect. Or you would need the ability to change the past so that you could go back in time, break into the chain of cause and effect with a different cause somewhere to cause a different future. Or you would need the ability to change the laws of physics so that the universe operated in some other fashion. And none of these things is possible. Or you would have to be able to control indeterminism, assuming that you could control it. But the only way you could possibly control indeterminism is with determinism, which takes us back to the original problem of controlling determinism. You cannot control indeterminism with indeterminism. You would never know what result you were going to get. So what do we mean when we talk about free will? We mean an urge or thought comes into our heads, and it may come from inside our unconscious brain, or it might be suggested by someone or something outside our brains. But however this urge or thought gets into our head in the first place, we use conscious free will to examine and manipulate that urge or thought. And then we use conscious free will, often using cost-benefit analysis, to decide whether or not to take action. But we have agreed at the outset that we're living in a natural material world. That means that our urges and thoughts are physical things that occur in our brains. There is no ghost in the machine. How can we freely control electrochemical reactions, urges and thoughts in our brain, since that control itself would be electrochemical and would have had its own cause? People say they believe in cause and effect, but then somehow believe that how their brains operate is an exception to the rule. An example of how our thoughts are material things in the brain is that certain types of words and the images they evoke light up different parts of our brains. Another example of how our urges and thoughts are material things is that magnetic coils can be used to affect a person's brain to get them to involuntarily move parts of their bodies. And finally, artificially stimulating a brain region believed to play a key role in learning, reward, and motivation caused monkeys to change which of two images they chose to look at, essentially making decisions for them and controlling their mind. So here's the great catch-22 of free will and determinism. In order for your will, free or not, to work properly, you need determinism to operate almost all the time. You need it to be the case that one thought can lead to the next one in an orderly fashion. And that once a decision has been made to do something, that thought can be reliably translated into action. But only determinism can guarantee this. Otherwise, you wouldn't think straight, and your intention would be followed by an unpredictable action. But if determinism is true, then there's no free will. There are a lot of definitions and positions on free will. It's amazing. I was looking at like the Wikipedia and philosophy sites, and there's like 14 different categories of free will. Today I'm just going to talk about the three main ones. All the others are kind of subsets of these. So far, the type of free will we've been talking about is called libertarian free will. In other words, a will that is free from determinism, free from a preceding cause that determines it. However, most people who believe in libertarian free will agree that determinism doesn't allow for it, but they do believe that some sort of indeterminism does allow for it. But as I pointed out earlier, since we can't control indeterminism, it can't allow for free will. The next main position on free will is incompatibilism. Regular incompatibilism is the view that free will is not free from determinism. Free will is incompatible with determinism. And hard incompatibilism is the view that free will is also not free from indeterminism. So a hard incompatibilist says that free will is incompatible with determinism and it's incompatible with indeterminism, and that kind of covers all possibilities. So if you haven't guessed by now, I'm a hard indeterminist, or incompatibilist. Now the main position, the final main position on free will is called compatibilism. Compatibilism ignores the internal forces of determinism and indeterminism in your brain. Instead, it redefines free will to ask if there are any external barriers to enacting your will, such as electrodes in your brain or chains on your body. Compatibilist free will is compatible with both determinism and indeterminism because its definition of free will has nothing to do with determinism or indeterminism. However, in my view, this is an incorrect definition of free will, and therefore it reaches an improper conclusion. Compatibilist free will is the freedom to act on your unfree will, not free will itself. Here's an analogy as to why I think compatibilist free will is wrong. Suppose I gave you a photograph of a pinball game with a ball caught in flight at the top. From the picture, it would seem like the ball had multiple paths that it could take. However, once you know the ball's mass, the ball's speed, the direction of the ball, the density of the air, the amount of gravity, the angle of the surface, the coefficient of friction, you'd realize that the ball had no choice but to fall in only one path. There was nothing blocking it from taking alternative paths. However, those alternative paths were never true possibilities, given the pre-existing forces acting on the ball. Now, some materialists think they found 6 loopholes that allow for free will. The first apparent loophole, as I mentioned earlier, is indeterminism. However, the very definition of indeterminism means that we can't determine it. We have no way of consciously or unconsciously controlling unpredictable events. And what follows an indeterminate event is still determined by that event. So there's no free will there. The second apparent loophole is random noise in the brain. But if it's truly random and not determined, then by definition we can't control it. And if it is actually determined, then we also can't control it because we can't control determinism. So there's no free will there. The third apparent loophole is that human thought is very complex, but complexity only puts limits on our ability to scan a brain and predict what choice will be made. Complexity does not alter the laws of physics, either determinism or indeterminism, so there's no free will there. The fourth apparent loophole is that we don't know what causes consciousness. But consciousness is still a material thing, and still subject to the same mostly deterministic universe as the rest of our bodies. So there's no free will there. And the fifth apparent loophole is that if we're really non-free will robots, then consciousness would be unnecessary. We'd just, operate on a program. Why bother to be conscious? However, without consciousness, we could only react to our environment. Consciousness allows our brains to imagine potential futures, thus increasing our chances of survival, even if we don't have free will. And finally, some people think of free will as an emergent property, but they never tell us how free will emerges. And to me, the phrase emergent property is a magical term. It's kind of like the word God, it explains nothing. So there's no free will there either. We usually think of our thought processes this way. From unconscious thought or urge, to conscious thought or urge, to decision, to action or inaction. But guess what? That's not how it works at all. It turns out that our unconscious minds actually make the decision before we have the illusion that we're consciously making a decision. A number of laboratory experiments on human volunteers have demonstrated unconscious brain activity before a conscious choice. And this is how they do it. They get a computer and they start a clock, an image of a clock running on the computer. And they put wires on the subject's head or put them in a scanning machine to scan their brains. And they say, now, whenever you want, press a button. And when that desire to press the button comes into your head, tell us what number it's on, where the clock is. So the clock starts running and they might say, well, the thought popped into my head right there, right after the 4. Thought popped into my head to press the button. Well, as it turns out, there's unconscious brain activity just before that. And I'll mention a few experiments about this, but that's how they test it. There's when you have the illusion of making the choice, and there's when your brain actually did make the choice right before that. In 1983, neuroscientist Benjamin Libet asked volunteers wearing EEG electrodes on their heads to lift your finger whenever you feel the urge to do so. And when they did, the finger movements were preceded by a dip in the signals being recorded in the brain's motor cortex called the readiness potential. In other words, the unconscious mind became active 0.3 of a second before the conscious mind made a choice. Now, some people just dismiss that and they said, well, of course, your brain is getting ready to make that. The activity just represented your brain getting ready to make a decision. It wasn't the decision itself. Well, then they refined the experiment. In 2008, neuroscientist John Dylan Hayes and others asked volunteers to tap one of 2 buttons at will with a finger of their left or their right hand, and he used an fMRI scanner to monitor the brains. Part of the prefrontal cortex, which is vital for executive thought and consciousness, lit up about 7 seconds before volunteers pressed a button. Furthermore, deciding to press the left or right button revealed slightly different brain patterns, enabling the team to predict 60% of the time which button would be pressed. So in this case, you couldn't say it was not just getting ready to make a decision. The fact that they could tell a different signal as to whether it was going to be the left or the right finger means the decision had been made already. In 2011, Itzhak Fried demonstrated that the activity of 256 neurons in the brain was sufficient to predict with 80% accuracy a person's decision to move 7/10 of a second before he became aware of it. Free will is not necessary to explain any thought or action. There would have been no natural selection advantage in favor of a free will mutation, if such a free will mutation was even possible. Occam's razor suggests that the simplest answer is usually the correct one. So as we look at the evolution of life, I think we can at least agree that no free will is the simplest option that we can choose. So I think we can agree that at least the lower life forms, single-celled life, we don't think has any free will, etc. And it's only when we get into the higher animals and humans that we have this idea that we have free will. So not only do I not see how free will is physically possible, I see no reason why it would have evolved if we don't need it. Evolution is blind as to whether or not we have free will. It simply rewards good survival decisions. It doesn't matter if those decisions are the result of free will choices or non-free will programming. Just as it is easier to see the faults in others than it is to see the faults in ourselves, so too it is easier to see a lack of free will in other people than it is to see it in ourselves. Our tendency to see conscious free will is so strong that we even project it onto other life forms. That hornet got mad and stung me. That flower wants to face towards the sun. So why do we resist accepting that free will is an illusion? There's several reasons, but in the interest of time, let's just focus on the obstacle of ego. Some people don't want to admit that their senses might be fooling them, that the perception of free will is wrong. But this won't be the first time that we've been forced to accept an ego-shattering idea. We are not the special creation of a God. We're not the center of the solar system, not even the center of the universe. We're not a special species in nature, and we don't live forever. And each time we got over the disillusionment. But is the realization that free will is an illusion really such a bad conclusion? The rest of my talk deals with the ramifications of a world in which free will doesn't exist. And by the end of my talk, you might agree with me that it's a good thing that we don't have free will. The consequences of the free will illusion and its impact on moral responsibility. So we'll start with a little comic relief here. Do you think the chemistry of the brain controls what people do? Of course. Then how can we blame people for their actions? Because people have free will to do as they choose. Are you saying that that free will is not part of the brain? Well, of course it is. But it's the part that's a part of the brain that's out there, just kind of being free. So you're saying that the free will part of the brain is exempt from the natural laws of physics. Obviously, otherwise we couldn't blame people for anything they do. So do you think the free will part of the brain is attached, or does it just kind of float nearby? Shut up. A couple of years ago, I read an article in a science magazine titled something like, "Free will is an illusion, but don't tell anyone." A lot of people are afraid that we'll change our behavior for the worse if we find that we're not in control. In fact, some studies have shown some short-term negative effects if you suggest or convince people that there's no free will. But I have 4 responses to that. First, if free will is an illusion, then we're better off preparing for the truth rather than running away from it. Second, I'm not convinced that there are long-term negative consequences to the idea that there's no free will. The same positive and negative feedback and consequences will still be at work regarding our actions. Third, the same gloomy scenario was predicted if people realized that gods didn't exist, and it didn't happen. And fourth, there are benefits to realizing that free will is an illusion, and I'll talk more about those shortly. As you mull over the possibility that free will is an illusion, your initial reaction might be the same as mine, a sort of fatalism. Why should I bother to do anything if it's out of my control? Why not be passive, lie in bed all day, and wait for things to happen to me since I can't control them anyway? I'll try it sometime. We're programmed by evolution to get bored because doing nothing is usually a poor survival strategy, while being curious about and investigating our environment is usually an excellent survival strategy. Soon you will be compelled to rise up out of your bed and pursue something that interests your brain. Enjoy the journey. Life is interesting because we can't always predict how our environment, especially people, will change, how we will react, and what thoughts will pop into our head. An omniscient being might know these things, like the class's demon, but we are not omniscient. If we were, life would probably be boring. And if you are enjoying your life, then does it really matter if it's the result of brilliant free will decisions that you're making or a great program running in your unconscious mind? The result is the same. But what if you're not enjoying your life? Is there any hope? Well, I'll have an answer for that momentarily. So if we're not in control, then what is? Well, we're back to the natural material world. First, there are the forces of nature that affect all objects in the universe, things like gravity, heat, electricity, and chemical reactions. Then there's the force of nature that affects living things, in particular, evolution. Who we are is, of course, a product of genetics and our environment. We are evidence gathering, reason employing, problem solving, survivalists, and procreationists. Although some of us don't procreate, we just go through the motions. We experience positive and negative feedback and adjust our behavior accordingly. No free will is necessary for us to do this. And part of the environment that affects us is our fellow human beings. How we interact with and influence each other is part of evolution. Not only are we encountering other human beings, but our relationship with them is crucial. And once again, this is determined by evolution. We evolved as a social species, and that makes a huge difference. Within a tribe, and more between tribes, we both compete and cooperate, but cooperation is the most important of the two. And it's this tendency to cooperate, programmed into us by evolution, that should give us reason to be optimistic about our future, even if free will is an illusion. As I said a moment ago, if we're experiencing happy lives, then the illusion of free will shouldn't upset us. That robotic brain of ours is doing the job that it evolved to do. But if we're not experiencing happy lives, we need not automatically despair. Our evolved brains, if they're functioning correctly, will continue to seek solutions to make us happy. And if our brains are not functioning correctly, or we fail to discover a solution, we still don't need to immediately worry. There's a good chance our fellow human beings will try to help us out. If you want to read more about the evolution of empathy and morality, I can recommend two books, and there's lots of books out there, but these two are really like Wild Justice, The Moral Lives of Animals, and The Age of Empathy, Nature's Lessons for a Kinder Society. In his book, The Social Conquest of Earth, biologist E.O. Wilson observes, colonies of cheaters lose to colonies of cooperators. Sports teams are an excellent example of both competition and cooperation, and it may surprise most of us to learn that cooperation is more important than competition. Some of the ways in which sports teams cooperate to help each other is to have rules and referees, that last place teams select first in the draft, revenue sharing among teams, and team salary caps. Notice that it's in a team's self-interest to cooperate. Otherwise, the league would collapse into a handful of powerful teams, and it would not generate as much overall revenue. By the way, altruism is also an illusion, and what's called reciprocal altruism is not really altruism. Even if we had free will, everybody always does what they want to do, even if it's only choosing the lesser of two or more evils. But altruism certainly loses its meaning if free will is an illusion. Fortunately, we don't have to rely on altruism. In a social species, in the long run, evolution rewards cooperation over competition and conflict. So, how should the knowledge that free will is an illusion affect our ethics and system of justice? Well, instead of talking about moral versus immoral, ethical versus unethical, right versus wrong, it makes more sense to talk about helpful versus harmful. Our brains gather information, add it to previous experience, are influenced by our genetic predisposition, factor in incentives and disincentives, weigh the pros and cons of various options, attempt to predict the outcomes from various choices, then make the best choice possible within these limits and observe the outcome, which will inform future decisions. Again, there's nothing regarding how humans think or act that requires free will. Now let's focus on incentives and disincentives. Let's look at incentives for encouraging helpful behavior and disincentives for discouraging harmful behavior. Under incentives for encouraging helpful behavior, we have such things as praise, reward, reciprocity, and rehabilitation. Under disincentives for discouraging harmful behavior, we have such things as blame, shunning, punishment, and incarceration. People who commit harm are not subject to reaction from the rest of society in a moral sense, but in a practical sense. We should be judgmental toward the action, but not the person. There are practical reasons for acting against harmful people: to protect society from the criminal, to protect the criminal from society, vigilantism, rehabilitation, and as a warning to other would-be criminals. So this is why we can still even if there's no free will and people are not morally responsible, we can still justify taking action against harmful people in a practical sense. 350 years ago, the philosopher Spinoza figured this out. In the mind, there is no absolute or free will, but the mind is determined to wish this or that by a cause, which has also been determined by another cause, and this last by another cause, and so on to infinity. This doctrine raises social life, inasmuch as it teaches us to hate no man, neither to despise, to deride, to envy, or to be angry with any. So yes, if there's no free will, there's no responsibility, but there is still feedback and consequences. So how should we treat people? Let's compare two people. The first is an uneducated, unemployed, traumatized, hungry, poor person who steals an apple. And the second is an educated, employed, calm, greedy, rich person who steals $1 million. Try to get the most extreme. Even though neither of these people have free will, I think we instinctively know that we should treat each one differently. The key observation is the number of realistic choices. The key observation is the number of realistic choices that each person's brain would have had available to weigh and consider. Now, obviously, the first person had far fewer realistic choices than the second person. So based on this, we're better off treating the first person as if he had no free will, which indeed he doesn't. And our best approach is to give this person the means to have more socially approved choices the next time, such as by giving him education and a job. In the case of the second person, we're actually better off treating him as if he really did have free will, even though he doesn't. and giving him negative feedback and consequences for his harmful behavior, and this might include a fine or prison time. In both cases, though, the goal should be rehabilitation, not revenge. Although free will is an illusion, we need not view the world fatalistically or pessimistically. Things are not set in stone. Human brains are open to persuasion, since learning has survival benefit. So it's useful and not pointless for us to behave kindly toward each other and to try to persuade others to behave kindly as well. As a social species, our chances of survival tend to increase if we get along with one another. And furthermore, any society that does not make full use of all the positive talents of all its citizens will eventually be outcompeted by societies that do. This is why equal rights and opportunities for all people, regardless of race, gender, or sexual orientation, are inevitable. Might take a while. It's the long term. Take, for example, marriage equality for gays and lesbians. It's inevitable because it causes no harm and benefits society, because long-term stable adult relationships, gay or straight, benefit society. Eventually, most people's brains will figure this out and will be compelled to stop wasting valuable resources on homophobia and persecution. The young people figure this out. They got better things to do. They got real problems, not imaginary problems. So here are some of the benefits that come from realizing that free will is an illusion. To help us be less judgmental and more forgiving towards ourselves and other people. To help us let go of feelings of hatred, revenge, and retribution. To help us design better ways of modifying behavior for the good. To help us improve our criminal justice system, rehabilitation, not revenge. To realize that compassion and love are still genuine and helpful, and we should do all we can to encourage them. And to help us focus on our long-term evolutionary tendency towards cooperation and equality. It's lucky that we can trust that in a social species like humans, evolution will tend to direct us toward these positive outcomes. We don't have to rely on the unpredictability of free will. So as I said earlier, it's a good thing that free will doesn't exist. Do not despair. Evolution is in control. We're a social species, and societies of cooperators outperform societies of cheaters. And we have a bright future ahead of us. We can't help it.